hear from Mr. Jim Moulthrup, and he's from FP2 for Pavement Preservation, and he's going to speak today on legislative updates and new transportation incentives.
Thank you, Renee. Good afternoon. Some of you, I think, know that FP2 gets involved in several issues, advocacy for pavement preservation being one of them, research where we both support it and fund it, and then finally communication. We publish a journal quarterly and we have a website, etc. So I'm going to talk about today is some of the advocacy piece that we work with. And I would note that maybe some of you with agency folks, AASHTO and Federal Highway may have a little more knowledge about this and more information than I'm going to share. But at any rate, the real question is 2018 this year, is it the year for infrastructure legislation or not? And I'll remind you that infrastructure is not just roads and bridges. It's a lot of other things. It's broadband in rural areas. It's VA hospitals. It's a whole host of things that get involved from an infrastructure point of view, dams and waterways, et cetera. So roads and bridges are a piece of it, but there's a lot more to it. So I'll briefly run through some issues this year, take a look at the administration proposal that was done in February, and then a little bit on our advocacy piece coming up. So what are the priority issues right now in terms of Congress, both in the Senate and the House in Washington? First of all is the FAA reauthorization bill. The timeline on that is September 30th. This is, of course, with the T&I committee in the House and also the EPW committee in the Senate. The appropriation bills for 2019, that's on the agenda. Judicial and other confirmations, and unless you've been in a cave for a long time, you realize that there are a number of judicial as well as staff and other confirmations people that hasn't happened. Some of them haven't even been approached and appointed at this stage of the game. So, and there are a number of agencies where this is an issue. Then there's the infrastructure package, trade as another thing that's on the agenda, fixes to the tax bill, and then continuing regulatory reform. So you can see that in 2018, there's a lot on the table in Washington, and one of those things in the midst, of course, is the infrastructure package. What has happened so far? Budget deal was passed in February, which gave us a 2-year spending cap, increased some domestic spending and so forth, you see there, and added an additional $20 billion for infrastructure. That's $10 billion a year. And it waived the budget ceiling until 2019, which is kicking the can down the road a little bit, but at the same time giving them some more operating leeway, if you will, to get things done. And then they passed an appropriations bill in March of this year for 2018. So the President's Initiative for Rebuilding Infrastructure in America was issued in February. It made a lot of headlines, and most of you may be familiar with what's within this document. But I will tell you there's no details. It's very, very sketchy in terms of overall, maybe at the 50,000 foot level, but there's nothing down there in the weeds, so to speak, to let you know about what some of the specific issues are. So the question is, how much money is involved in it? $1 trillion over 10 years with $200 billion direct federal funds. So if you're looking at those numbers and you're saying, where's that $800 billion coming from? Well, over that 10-year time frame, you wouldn't be surprised to find out that a lot of that is going to be factored in with local and state funding rather than FHWA or the federal government. Incentivizes private state local match, trying to look at reversing the current 80-20 split. There's also been, in terms of the incentivization program, there's something used to be called the Tiger Grants, are now called Build Grants. It's increased from $500 million a year to $1.5 trillion, so it's a significant amount of money. And there is a new selection criteria, is the creation of new local revenue, such as gas tax or tolling. And there's a 3-year look back on this to see if it's working or not. One federal decision on environmental reviews is a significant change that's occurred. And there's some funding that's available because of that, a number of agencies trying to go through the approval process. Those of you who work in that area know exactly what I mean and how long it can take. The Highway Trust Fund shortfall, which I'll talk about in a minute. So then the question is, what's in it in terms of the big picture? There are 4 buckets of funding, if you will. The incentive grants, rural infrastructure program, which includes broadband, for example. Transformative projects, something that's new and innovative and will transform a particular use or system. And then additional money for TIFIA, which is the Transportation Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act, and also the same thing from the water point of view. When is it going to happen? So there's a package that's been out there from the administration. It's been evaluated in terms of the overall concepts. But the real question is, when's it actually going to happen? Will it be this year or when? So, as I said, it was released in February. We do know that both the House and Senate committees are drafting legislation, and they're going to take it up. And the question is, will it happen in 2018 or not? There's so many other things on the table that it's a $64,000 question as to whether it's going to happen this year or not. Taking a look historically, both parties have supported infrastructure. And this is one area where they've worked together historically over the years. Actually, the House passed the FAA bill, you see there, by a significant vote margin. The issue has been nonpartisan, as I've said. The question is, unless you, again, been in that cave, you know that there's been a lot of discussion about the November elections coming up and how contentious it might be. And that, of course, makes things even worse in terms of trying to work together. So can it happen? The agenda is fairly limited in terms of the broad things that I mentioned, but there's about 100 days left now, legislative days left in this year. There'll be an August recess, and then everybody will go home in October for the elections, for campaigning. So you can see that the time squeeze gets pretty big in order to get all these things that I mentioned earlier accomplished. You know, and the fact is that the infrastructure bill is one of them. Is it possible that after the election in November and between January and when new people are seated, that could happen then? Possibly. There's about 65 representatives who are retiring this year at the end of this session, which is very unusual. Mostly, since the 90s, there were something like 62 in 1992, but this year it's 67. Significant amount in both the House and the Senate, and in both parties, for that matter. So where's the money? Will states support the administration concept of devolving infrastructure funding? That's a good question. The executive director for Mississippi talked about earlier on in her comments about, you know, the funding is a very, very difficult issue for everybody. So there was some discussion about repatriation in the tax bill, coming back and using that money, talking about the tax money that's been overseas for a number of years, and they reduced the rate from 35 to 20%, bringing that money back into the U.S., and it would go into the infrastructure plan in somehow, some way. Didn't happen. There's a lot of debate about user fee, whether it's a gas tax or a user fee, however you want to posture it. But there's a lot of opposition to it as well in terms of increasing it. It hasn't been increased since 1993. Vehicle miles tax, that's been something that's talked about, and as I put here, not ready for prime time yet. There's been a lot of issues relating to privacy, whether they're true or not. Even if you have a cell phone, everybody knows where you are anyhow. So what happens there, it remains to be seen. And then there's tolls, the potential applicability, and of course backlash. I can't imagine that there would be a toll road in Wyoming, for example. So that's probably not going to happen. So where's the money? The real issue is the Highway Trust Fund, which has been insolvent for some time, as most of you know. When the FAST Act was passed in 2015, there was a $70 billion shortfall in the Highway Trust Fund that had to be transferred from the general fund. And if current projections hold, you'll see the numbers there from 20 to 26, how much it will be per year. So there's a real need to fix the Highway Trust Fund. And some might argue to say, well, the Highway Trust Fund's kind of antiquated, isn't it? It's based on fuel tax and some other taxing and so forth. We have electric cars now, and we have this and we have that. But the point is that it's a lockbox. It's there. That funding goes into the Highway Trust Fund. It stays there, and it's only distributed as per, as Luis was talking about, as per criteria that's been established for that distribution. So the fact that it's there, and the idea that if you would change that, that's going to take a lot of time and a lot of effort by a lot of people to convince to get the legislation done to come up with something else besides the Highway Trust Fund. So yes, in today's world it's necessary. Will it be necessary tomorrow or as we move on? Probably not. There'll be some changes to it, but it works right now. It's very good, and there's a real issue with it. Our advocacy is the takeaway that we get is whatever gets bandied about this year in terms of the planning and so forth will certainly become involved with the legislation that's going to be done coming up. Fully funded Highway Trust Fund is critical, we think. We think there's a real need to continue educating and advocating for pavement preservation, both at the national level and local level. Well, you've heard some of the reasons why already discussed at this meeting, and you'll hear a lot more as the meeting progresses. We are working actually with a number of other work groups within DC to align the messaging. Oftentimes when we talk to staff or the legislators, their question is, what do you want? And the question is, the answer to that is very important, has to be put together correctly and make a lot of sense so that you can talk about it and explain it. Matter of fact, ARTBA's fly-in is tomorrow and Wednesday in Washington, and there'll be a lot of industry folks getting to DC today to meet with legislators and talk about the need to get a lot of these things done. Next up is the highway bill, away from infrastructure now, but the highway bill, the FAST Act, expires in 2020. That's only 2 years away, and work will begin in earnest, I'm sure, in 2019 on both the Senate and the House committees. That's about it, what I have to say about the advocacy piece. People who make the ability for myself to travel to these meetings and participate, I always like to tell you who our contributors are, and we really appreciate it, both from the corporate sponsor work as well as the associations. And usually I end up with a slide like everybody else has so far today with a question, do you have any questions? The problem is I don't have any answers to what I talked about, so I don't have a slide that has a question mark on it. So I thank you for your attention. I'll be here for a while, answer any questions you might have or get involved in any discussion you might have. Thank you.
The preceding was produced by the National Center for Pavement Preservation. More information can be found on the web at pavementpreservation.org. Additional support provided by Michigan State University.